Wide receivers have been all over the map lately, and some stars are finally heating up and others are ghosting lineups completely. So let's calm the chaos and break down which wideouts you can trust in week 7 and which ones might be breaking your heart again. What's up, Headliner Nation? My name is Brad, the Rankings King, and before we dive into this week's rankings, just a reminder that these are the consensus rankings between Jake and Kyle. For more detailed analysis, make sure to check out the start-sit videos from Kyle already posted this week, and if you want even more breakdowns each week, join the Fantasy Headliners community by hitting that join button below. That's going to get you access to extra rankings like flex, kicker, defense, and a spot inside of our Discord. Now, before we dive into week 7 rankings, we've got a few hits and misses from week 6. Our first hit was Drake London, and listen, I saw the comments. We had people saying that we were too high on Drake. We had him all the way up in tier 1 as the wide receiver 4, and guess what? He finished as wide receiver 2. Next up was Tet McMillan, and another guy that we ranked super high in week 6. We had him at wide receiver 12, and he finished as wide receiver 12. And then what about AJ Brown? I mean, when you hit on AJ Brown being the wide receiver 22, it's both impressive and a little depressing. Okay, so there's our hits. What about our misses? And we'll start with Xavier Worthy. He had a chance for a big game before the return of Rashee Rice, but we ranked him really highly, and he finished wide receiver 26. Ouch. What about Rondell Robinson? I mean, we expected more, but we thought that that would come in the form of receptions rather than the big touchdown play. We had him just inside the top 30, but he finished wide receiver 10. And then what about Jameson Williams? Predicting the boom weeks of Jameson Williams is harder than a Cadillac axle to figure out, and the truth is we just missed it this week. All right, so there's your hits and misses from week 6. Let's move on to week 7. In tier 1, we've got Jackson Smith and Jigba, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson, Rome Odunze, Nico Collins, Drake London, Devontae Adams, and DK Metcalf. Topping the list at number 1, we've got Jackson Smith and Jigba, and he's the only wide receiver in fantasy that's had 10-plus fantasy points in every game this year. It's going to be a tough week this week, though, because he's going to draw the coverage from Derek Stingley, who's already basically shut down Adams, Evans, and BTJ already this year. At number 2, we've got Amon-Ra St. Brown, and week 6 was terrible, sucked, right? But the volume was there. He still had 10 targets and 9 receptions, but only had 45 yards. For some reason, he was running those underneath like short routes, and so we're hoping that that was just an outlier and we're going to get more deep shots against Tampa. At number 3, we've got Justin Jefferson, and he's coming off the bye week against an Eagles team that is on the struggle bus. The big question here is really quarterback. Is it going to be Carson Wentz or JJ McCarthy? We'd love to see Wentz against his former team. Plus, we've seen Jefferson go for over 120 yards in back-to-back games with Wentz. At number 4, we've got Rome Odunze, and the final stat line in week 6 was bad, but man, there were so many fantasy points left on the field. Caleb missed a couple of big plays, and dude, we had a touchdown called back because of some nonsense flag, and now he gets the Saints, who allow over 28 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. At number 5, we've got Nico Collins, also coming off the bye, and even though Nico has been solid this year, we haven't seen the big blow-up game yet. Seattle currently has 3 starters, though, in their secondary questionable to play, so we may get that big game this week. At number 6, we've got Drake London going to San Francisco, and London has played 3 games this year where he's fully healthy, and in those 3 games, he has 41 targets, 26 receptions, and 323 yards. He is clearly the first place that Penix looks weekly, and with all the injuries in San Fran, he could feast again. At number 7, we've got Devontae Adams, and with Puka doubtful with an ankle injury, we may see a ton of targets go the way of Adams. Even with Puka, he's had 8-plus targets in 5 of 6 games, and now he gets the Jags, who allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At number 8, we've got DK Metcalf going to Cincinnati, and DK's been propped up by touchdowns, but here's the thing. He's getting those touchdown chances weekly. He's also coming off a season high in targets, and Calvin Austin is still not practicing, and now we get Cincinnati, who allows over 27 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. All right, before we head into the next tier, I want to make sure that you're all set up on Underdog. You already know that we're crushing those player pick'ems on Underdog this year, so what are you waiting for? Head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. Create a new account using the referral code HEADLINERS when you do so. Then just make your initial deposit and come join a contest. And if you sign up with that promo code, again, it's HEADLINERS, you'll get access to all of the promo codes that Underdog offers weekly throughout the year. And check this out. When you play your first $5, they're going to give you a $100 bonus. That's right. Play 5, get 100. It's that easy. And don't forget, Jake is going to be breaking down the best picks weekly in our show on Fridays. And so links to join are in the description. And we look forward to playing with you on Underdog this week. All right, let's move it on to tier 2. We've got Jamar Chase, George Pickens, Courtland Sutton, Deebo Samuel, Ladd McConkey, Jalen Waddle, Ted McMillan, Brian Thomas Jr., and Rashee Rice. At number 9, we've got Jamar Chase, and the Bengals may not win another game, but as long as Flacco continues to feed Chase, I'll take it. And in their first game together, Chase had 12 targets and 10 catches, 94 yards, and a touchdown against Green Bay. Now he gets Jalen Ramsey, so it's going to be fun. At number 10, we've got George Pickens, and he's the wide receiver 3 overall, but Lamb's return is close. You have to think that this time as the number 1 with Dak, though, clearly worked wonders for their chemistry, and Washington allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, so let's shoot for touchdowns in 6 straight games for George Pickens. At number 11, we've got Courtland Sutton, and the biggest issue with Sutton is how low the floor is. He's already had 2 games this year with 1 catch and less than 20 yards, and that makes him more matchup dependent. Luckily, though, the Giants allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, so we have him there at number 11. At 12, we've got Deebo Samuel, and McLaurin has a chance to return this week. It's clear that Deebo isn't 100% healthy the last 2 weeks, but he's still playing the same amount of snaps. And there's no better matchup than this, though. Dallas allows the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers on the season. At number 13, we have Ladd McConkey, and it's clear that the injury to Quentin Johnston has been a huge benefit to the production of Ladd. Touchdowns in back-to-back games, and now he gets the best matchup he's had in the last couple weeks. Indy allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At 14, we've got Jalen Waddle, and the bump in targets since the Tyreek injury has really elevated Waddle weekly. He now has back-to-back games with at least 12 fantasy points, and Cleveland is way easier to throw on than they are to run on, and so hopefully that helps him in week 7. At number 15, we've got King Ted McMillan, and he finally found the end zone in week 6, and he enjoyed it so much that he found it twice. Now, it was his worst volume and yardage game of the year in a great matchup against Dallas, and this is going to be more difficult this week against the Jets. At number 16, we've got Brian Thomas Jr., and we were nervous for a couple of weeks there, but he's finally starting to turn things around. He now has 10-plus fantasy points in back-to-back games. Now, he did benefit from all the injuries in Seattle last week, but getting him the ball down the field, that's all that matters. The Rams are not going to be an easy matchup, though. At number 17, we have Rashee Rice returning, and a little behind the curtain here, Jake is for sure higher on Rice than Kyle. Last time we saw him, he averaged 10 targets, 8 catches, and 96 yards a game. There's a competition for targets, but Rice should be the volume guy, and Vegas allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. All right, that's it for Tier 2. Let's look at Tier 3. We have Chris Olave, Xavier Worthy, Jordan Addison, Keenan Allen, Stephon Diggs, Michael Pittman Jr., A.J. Brown, Kendrick Bourne, and Wan'Dale Robinson. At number 18, we have Chris Olave, and Olave is all about the volume, and that's about it. He isn't going to rack up a lot of touchdowns, and he isn't going to rack up a ton of yards weekly, but averaging over 10 targets a game makes him a low-end wide receiver 2 weekly. And Chicago also allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At number 19, we've got Xavier Worthy, and with the return of Rashee Rice, Worthy is going to return to more of that big play dependent type role. For sure, he can still do something consistently, but the volume is going to dip. But there is a great matchup, though, this week against Vegas. At number 20, we have Jordan Addison. He's coming off the bye week, and he's scored 10-plus fantasy points in both of his games this season. If McCarthy returns, let's hope that that volume stays. It's worth noting, though, that Philly has struggled stopping opponents' passing game as of late in 2025. At 21, we have Keenan Allen, and have the wheels finally come off for Keenan? We really don't think so. He still has had 16 targets the last 2 weeks, and he's just only been able to bring in 9 of them. But with Indy allowing over 30 fantasy points per game to wide receivers, let's hope for a bounce back week. At number 22, we have Stephon Diggs, and this New England offense hates your fantasy team. Each week, they utilize a different weapon. Diggs was unstoppable in weeks 4 and 5, yet only got 3 targets in week 6. And this Tennessee defense, really good pass defense. They're easier to run on than they are to throw on. At number 23, we have Michael Pittman Jr., and with Josh Downs getting more and more targets, that's just taking away from Pittman. He's had no less than 50 yards in 4 of his 6 games, but he does have 4 touchdowns. But this week against LA is going to be one of his toughest matchups of the year. At number 24, we have AJ Brown, and everybody stay calm because we just had 2 weeks in a row with AJ Brown getting more than 10 fantasy points. The Philly offense has been underwhelming and now has a matchup against Minnesota, who's coming off a bye, and they allow the fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At number 25, we have Kendrick Bourne, and back-to-back 140-yard games, but Kittle should be back. Pearsall is still questionable, and Jennings is trying to play with 5 broken ribs. We should have another week of some Bourne production, but Atlanta allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At 26, we have Wan'Dale Robinson, and he really benefited from a big touchdown play in week 6, but in a week like this where Surtain should be locking down an outside receiver, we could see Wan'Dale out of the slot. All right, that's it for Tier 3. Let's turn the page to Tier 4. We have Jameson Williams, T. Higgins, Matthew Golden, Trey Tucker, Devontae Smith, Tez Johnson, Romeo Doubs, Rashid Shaheed, and Christian Kirk. At 27, we have Jameson Williams, and we all know how boom or bust he is. The big plays have been a little more spread out this season, but he's one of those guys that can get hot quick. The Tampa secondary is banged up, so we're hoping for one of those big plays this week. At number 28, we have T. Higgins, and he tied a season high in targets with 8 last week with his first game of Joe Flacco. So there is a glimmer of hope, but it's hard to rely on him just yet. But there is a chance with Ramsey on Chase that he could get extra looks in week 7. At number 29, we have Matthew Golden, and he's really comparable to Jameson Williams. He's really big play dependent, and he's not really a red zone threat. Golden does have a catch of at least 34 yards or more, though, in 3 straight, so it's only a matter of time before he takes one of those to the house. At number 30, we have Trey Tucker, and with rumors out there of a Jacoby Myers trade in the future, there's a chance that he plays less snaps and Trey Tucker gets a bigger role. It's going to be hard to run on KC, so Vegas is going to have to throw to somebody. At number 31, we have Devontae Smith, and he remains so frustrating, really inconsistent, just like the entire Philly offense. At some point, they may figure it out, but for now, in a tough matchup against Minnesota, he stays in Tier 4 due to the risk. At number 32, we have Tez Johnson, and there's a lot of unknown in the Tampa offense due to all the injuries. Is it Tez Johnson, Cam Johnson, Sterling Shepard, or Cade Otton? One thing is for sure, though, they're going to have to keep throwing this week to beat Detroit. At number 33, we have Romeo Doubs, and 8+ targets in back-to-back games for Doubs is great, but he's in one of those spots where if he doesn't score a touchdown, he isn't going to get you 10 fantasy points per game. It's not like Arizona's a shutdown defense, though, so we'll see if he gets that touchdown chance this week. At number 34, we have Rashid Shaheed, and really similar to Doubs, volume is decent, but he isn't getting enough receptions per game to get you at least 10 fantasy points unless he finds the end zone. This is a great matchup for him, though, because Chicago allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At number 35, we have Christian Kirk, and he began to get ramped up before the bye week, and now he has a chance to excel in week 7 against a banged-up Seattle secondary. Here's the concern, though. Does he get the bump or another receiver like Xavier Hutchinson or Jaden Higgins? And rounding out the top 36, we have Alec Ayamanor, and with Calvin Ridley less than 100%, he should have a good opportunity to get extra targets this week. All right, that's it for our top 36 in tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we've got a couple guys on the outside looking in Jawan Jennings, Jacoby Myers, and Kayshon Boutte. And listen, we know there's a few high-profile players on the injury report as far as wide receivers, and they land on our injured studs list, and that's CeeDee Lamb, Quentin Johnston, Marvin Harrison Jr., Ricky Pearsall, Terry McLaurin, and Mike Evans. And obviously, if any of these guys get cleared, they're going to find a spot in the rankings above. But we got to get this video out to you before the Thursday game, so bear with us. These updates are minute to minute, and we'll keep you posted in the Discord as news develops, which, by the way, is exactly why you should join the Fantasy Headliners community. So tap that join button, boo-boo. Okay, so there's your Week 7 wide receiver rankings, and keep an eye on those injury updates. And remember, we're entering that what have you done for me lately territory when it comes to how we're ranking these guys. As always, like the video, honey bun, get subscribed, and while you're at it, hey, stay tuned for the rest of the rankings this week, and let's go get a W this week.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.